All right. Sorry about that. I did not know there's a little 15-minute limit. So, whatever. All right. So we were talking about, all right, the cells of the innate immunity, right? And so these are our first. One thing I didn't mention was these are our first leukocytes. So all of these right here, these are all white blood cells, and they're all leukocytes. So this is like if you have like, so all the cells that we're going to be talking about pretty much are going to be different types of leukocytes. So monocytes, macrophages, neutrophils, NK cells, mast cells. When we talk about B cells and T cells in the next video, those are also leukocytes. So all these are white blood cells that are circulating in your blood. And so what we have is the first cell we're going to talk about, though, are macrophages. And so what these do is they it's what's called phagocytize pathogens to remove them from the body. So phagocytize is a fancy word for just a cell eating something, right? And so what happens is you can kind of see it maybe a little bit here. What it does is it just moves its membrane and its cytoplasm just around something that would be in the center here, and then it combines these two little tips right here, and then it pinches off, and it forms what's called a vesicle inside of the macrophage, and then this cell will break down whatever inside this little compartment. So it's like a little amoeba eating something or something. And that's called phagocytizing. So what it does is it phagocytizes pathogens. So you can imagine like a little bacteria in here. Bacteria are typically extracellular, and so right, when we talk about extracellular pathogens, macrophages eat things that are extracellular. And so what's going to do is it's going to eat these pathogens and then remove them from the body. And then what it's going to do is after it eats it, it's going to say, oh, we have all these bacteria in our body here, and we're going to activate the adaptive immunity from that. But we'll talk about that later. The second thing are these neutrophils. So what these are is, so there's macrophages all over your tissues, right? In your leg, in your toe, in your lungs, in your arms, in your brain. There's macrophages all over the place. And they're just sitting there. They're there right now. What neutrophils are neutrophils are circulating actually in your blood, and they're not actually in your tissues. And so what neutrophils are, they're circulating, and then when a bacteria enters, let's say you get a cut on your arm, right? When bacteria enter these sites, neutrophils come out of the blood, so that's called recruited into the tissues, and they do the same thing that macrophages do, and in that they phagocytize pathogens. So there's not a little like this neutrophil right here isn't in the process of phagocytosis, but it still has the same ability to eat things that are outside of cells, and then remove them from the body, break them down. And so there's two, it's professional phagocytes, is what a lot of immunologists call them, are the macrophages and the neutrophils, and they eat things that are outside of cells. And that makes sense because, right, macrophages can then just eat what's outside, and they don't have to like deal with intracellular stuff. Cells that are involved in intracellular infections are called NK cells and mast cells. So we're not going to talk about mast cells too much. Pretty much all we're going to say about them is that they are involved in the allergic response, and that so like if you're a person who has like a peanut allergy or a shellfish allergy or something, what the problem is that your mast cells are going haywire when they don't really need to be. Now the allergic response is all this complicated mess that I'm not going to get into, but mast cells are highly involved with that, and they do something kind of similar. But we are going to talk about what's called an NK cell. NK stands for natural killer. I probably should have put that in here. But what these things is they they patrol the body, and what happens is they have a way to detect whether a cell is infected or not, right? Whether there's a pathogen inside your cell, right? Whether it be like a virus. Viruses are actually necessarily intracellular, and so if a virus infects a cell, NK cells can patrol the body, scan these little cells, and then say, oh, this one's actually infected here, And then what it does is it tells them to, it instructs the cell, the NK cell instructs the infected cell to die, or apoptose. And so that's kind of how your body deals with intracellular infections. So these are the cells that are involved here. The next thing we're going to talk about is what's called the inflammatory response. And we're going to put this all together at the end. So if you're a little bit confused, just hold up. But the inflammatory response is the way that your immune system kind of deals with a localized infection or a condition. So let's say, so this is what happens when you get a bug bite. And so when you get a bug bite, you realize that the region gets kind of red for starters. There comes a little bump on it, right? And then it gets all itchy, right, which is a type of pain. And these are all characteristic conditions of an inflammatory response. So here you can picture you have some injury. My dog's going crazy right now. No. Go lay down. I have the worst dog ever. Sit. Hold on. Okay. So what happens is that you have a bug bite, right? What it does is it like perforates the skin, right? So you can picture this as like a little spiky thing on the mosquito. And so what happens is that when it gets a little inside of you, it releases all these like harmful stuff, like bacteria, viruses, all kinds of stuff that are on these mosquitoes, and it causes this damage, right? And so what your cells do, and this is caused by your immune system, is that it causes all of these this sensation, right? There's pain involved. There's this warmth, inflammation, swelling, redness, and this happens a lot of the time. Anytime you have like some type of injury, right? So if you ever broken a bone, you notice that it gets really swollen and kind of gets hot and red. Other injuries, and what's cool is this is like a little experiment you can do at home. So if you take, and this is, I'm gonna try to do this. So if you take your arm and you take a little pin cap like this, and then you just lightly like scratch along your skin, what you can see is that your skin will, at first start, it will turn kind of white. We'll check on this periodically. You can see it kind of turn white for starters, and then it eventually turns red, like all around it, and then just the little line you drew along your forearm becomes red, and that's all because of your inflammatory response. So the whiteness is just your blood vessels constricting to prevent anything from moving across your body quickly. But then the redness, right, is all these leukocytes coming out of your blood, right, like the neutrophils we talked about, and they're coming out of your blood and into the site of injury, or like where you scratched yourself lightly. All right, I'm not liable for any stuff, blah blah blah. But yeah, that's your inflammatory response. So you can kind of see this yourself, and it's kind of a cool little trick you can do. And that's your immune system kind of reacting to your scratch. And so we're going to talk about, so this happens every time you have an intracellular or an extracellular infection. So we're going to talk about this response, and this kind of ties it all together, right? And so what happens is that the first thing that needs to happen is that you get past these physical barriers that we talked about, right? And so, right, this mosquito, right, it perforates your skin, and then because your skin is perforated, that's what allows all this injury to occur, and these little pathogens, whether they be, in this case, right, we're going to talk about the response to extracellular pathogens. So your skin gets perforated, right? So you breach the physical barriers, and these extracellular pathogens then enter the body, right? And so it's already overcome one arm of the immune system, right? The physical barrier, innate spot. And so the first thing that happens is that there are macrophages that are already in your tissues, right? So if you get a bug bite or a scratch on your forearm, right, and it's the first thing that happens is that there are macrophages just chilling right next to your muscle, right next to your forearm muscle, and then right when you get that bug bite and all these bacteria, these extracellular bacteria released, these macrophages eat up all these extracellular pathogens. And the next thing that they do is they say, oh, they signal to the rest of the body, we have an extracellular pathogen here, and the first thing they want to do is recruit neutrophils out of the body, so out of the bloodstream. And so these neutrophils get recruited out of the bloodstream, and they start to phagocytize. They do their job, and they phagocytize these pathogens. And so these are two different types of leukocytes that are helping the infection by eating these extracellular bacteria. The problem is that these two cells alone aren't typically good enough to overcome this pathogen. And so the next thing it does, and this is what we're going to talk about next, is that these two cell types, these neutrophils and macrophages, then signal to the body, oh, we need this thing called a B cell to secrete these things called antibodies, and we'll get into what that is in the next video. So this isn't comprehensive here yet. We'll finish the rest of this picture later, but I just want y'all to get that you have a breach of your physical barriers, and then this activates these two different types of leukocytes, these macrophages here, right? And then these macrophages phagocytize these bacteria, and then once they recognize that there's extracellular bacteria, it signals to neutrophils to come out of the blood, and then phagocytize bacteria as well. And so this is why the blood is a critical component of the immune system, right? And so what's happening here is that once we get rid of all these, right, we're restoring homeostasis. So once the extracellular bacteria enter the body, it's shifting the body out of equilibrium, and so your immune system's here to restore it. So the next thing we can talk about, so that was the extracellular response of the immune system. The next thing we're going to talk about is the intracellular response. So what happens is that, again, these physical barriers get breached. And we're talking about the skin in this example, but this is what happens when you have like some intestinal problems or like a sinus infection, right? You're breaching the little hairs in your skin, and you're breaching those mucosal linings and your gastric juice. You're overcoming these physical barriers. And what happens here is that these intracellular pathogens get released into your body, and they infect these cells. And so what happens is these NK cells that are, again, just like macrophages in that they are chilling in your tissues, but then once your cells get infected, they are scanning this and say, oh, crap, this little cell right here is infected. And so what it does is once it recognizes that these cells are infected, it becomes activated. And these NK cells, these natural killer cells, become activated and then release these things called cytokines that we're going to talk about in the next video. And then once these cytokines are released, it tells these cells, all right, just take an L for the body and just kill yourself. And that way these things that are replicating inside of cells, they are dying because the cells that they're replicating in are dying themselves. And so it's like, okay, just kill off this little thing of tissue. These other cells are going to grow and replace it, and we're going to be fine. We just got to kill it. And then eventually what happens is these NK cells, they activate these things called T cells, and then these things get recruited. We'll talk about these cells next. But these are, again, different leukocytes that are involved in the inflammatory response. So this is kind of just the big part, right? And so these leukocytes come from the blood. What I want y'all to get is that these leukocytes, these physical barriers get breached. These leukocytes come out of the blood and then get activated, right? And depending on what type of infection is what type of cells get activated. But then once they are activated, the pathogen eventually does get clear, and then you maintain this homeostasis. And so that's what's really important here. And so that's kind of just a general introduction to the innate immunity. And so in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the adaptive arm and those B cells and those T cells that I kind of mentioned, and how they play a role in this inflammatory response.